All right. Just want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Hope you had a great holiday yesterday with your families. I know I did. But I want to start off by saying that people should know by now in today's society that the internet is forever. So what you do and say on social media, whether it be Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Google Plus, whatever you post, whatever you say, whatever video you may make, that's forever. And whether you take it down, you don't know if someone saved it or someone recorded it or someone edited it, took it and played around with it. But what you put out there on the internet is eternal. And you really can't backtrack it. And fighters are no exception to that. We've seen Anthony Joshua post things or allegedly post things. We've heard interviews where fighters maybe a year ago said something, and a year later or 2 years later, they now make another comment or another statement that contradicts what they said in the past. So let's talk about this interview, shout out to FightHype.com, that they did with Keith Thurman a couple of days ago about him not wanting to fight Errol Spence in the near future, or him saying he's not ready to fight Errol Spence in the near future. Errol Spence is not in his immediate plans, or not even in his schedule, or not even in his thought process in the near future. Now, this is the problem with the whole thing, because I want to give another shout out to Dante's Boxing Nation, because I believe they did an interview, or he did an interview, Dante himself, with Keith Thurman back in 2015, and he talked to him about fighting Errol Spence. And this is the problem. You know, fighters will say things when they don't want to fight another fighter. And more often than not, it seems like they have to downplay the fighter and talk about the fighter in a dismissive way to basically convince people that, hey, I really don't need to fight this guy, I shouldn't fight this guy, or this guy's not as good as you, the public, perceive him to be. But the problem with that is when that fighter goes on, that said fighter, I should say, that the other fighter is criticizing, goes on to accomplish certain things, become a world champion, beat reputable fighters, you have to change your tune. You have to basically admit that, you know what, this fighter has earned his spot. Now, Keith Thurman said, you know what, I have 2 world titles. I'm the man in this division. I beat Danny Garcia. I beat Sean Porter. My resume, is impressive. And early on back in 2015, before Errol Spence became a world champion, he said that, Errol Spence needs to go on and accomplish more things and basically establish himself, fight some better fighters to prove that he belongs in the ring with me, or to prove that he belongs in a title shot with me, that he deserves a title shot with me. So Errol Spence went on to beat arguably the best welterweight in the world, or at least a welterweight that you could argue is in the top 2 or top 3, Kell Brook, IBF champion. So now he's IBF champion. And Errol Spence has called out Keith Thurman even before he was champion. And now that Errol Spence has accomplished what Keith Thurman had said he should have accomplished before he fought him, fought a top guy in Kell Brook, became a world champion. So he's basically earned his stripes now. He's basically evolved and elevated himself to a position where he should be fighting the best in the division now, because arguably he's in the top 2 or top 3 himself now. I'm sure anyone would argue that Errol Spence is at the very least a top 3 welterweight. I think he's the best welterweight. A lot of other people agree with me, but you could at least put him in the top 3. So that definitely warrants a fight with Keith Thurman. But the big problem is here. I mean, we know Keith Thurman is coming off an injury. Okay? We know Keith Thurman is coming off an injury. We know that he's going to need at least 1 tune-up fight, possibly 2. But for him to sit there and totally dismiss Errol Spence, it almost reminds me of a guy, if you guys had friends in school and they'd be like, oh, I want to get with that girl, and the girl's like one of the prettiest girls in your class or whatever, and he's like, yeah, I want to get with that girl. So he tries to get with that girl, and that girl all of a sudden decides, hey, I don't like you, kind of brushes him off, pushes him off to the side. And then he comes back to you and said, you know what? She really isn't that pretty after all. I was looking at her. She had her hair up the other day. She had a scar behind her ear. She's flawed. She's not really pretty. So basically, what I think Keith Thurman is trying to do is he's trying to downplay Errol Spence. I know Dante's Boxing Nation, he mentioned that in his video when he was referencing his previous interview with Keith Thurman. There's no problem with Keith Thurman saying, hey, you know what? I'm coming back off an injury. I'm going to need at least one or two tune-up fights. I definitely want to fight Errol Spence. But the way he's approaching it, saying I'm not ready for him. And, I don't want to take it out of context. He kind of alluded to the fact that, yeah, I'm not ready right now because I have to come off I got to rehab. I got to get back into the swing of things. I need a couple fights to get back to my fighting shape level. I got to kind of shake off the rust, so to speak, and I get that. But I also, want to commend, I think it was Ben Thompson. I couldn't tell if it was Ben Thompson 100% in that interview, but I think it was. I loved how he kind of set the tone for that interview. He made Keith Thurman say things that I think if he went back and thought about it after watching the video himself, probably wouldn't have revealed those things. But I love what the Fight Hype interviewer did in that video. He was kind of leading them along, kind of making them feel comfortable, kind of saying, hey, I know you're coming off injury. Of course, you're not going to fight, a fighter like Errol Spence right away. You're going to need to tune up, and then you're going to have to probably fight a mandatory. So, I mean, realistically speaking, this fight can't really happen in the near future, blah, blah. So he kind of put Keith Thurman in a situation where he let his guard down. He was willing to reveal things that he probably didn't want to say. So I like that. That's really good journalism. That's how you interview somebody. You don't have to go out there and put someone on blast and needle them and make them all defensive. So shout out to Fight Hype. I think it was Ben Thompson. It had to have been. It sounded like him. I don't know 100% sure because sometimes with the audio, where the interviewer is, you can't always tell who it is. Sometimes people sound like other people, but I think that was Ben Thompson. So if that was you, Ben Thompson, whoever that interview was, shout out to you because that was great journalism. That was great interviewing, a beautiful style. I like how you kind of disarmed Keith Thurman and put him in a position where he felt comfortable that he was just going to talk freely. And because of that, we got a real good headline that's basically sending a ripple across boxing right now, or at least in these last couple of days. But with that being said, I think the big problem is, even when Anthony Joshua said about Deontay Wilder, this could be 2019, this could be 2020. I'm the man. I decide what I want to do, and it's just irritating because in the sport of boxing, you want to see the best fighters fight the best. Obviously, that's not always going to happen in the real world because there's egos involved. People want certain things. Certain fighters want certain percentages, and obviously the negotiation process is definitely a long, drawn out type of series of events, and that's just the way it's been if you've been following the sport of boxing for as long as I have, or most of you have, or even if you haven't in these recent years. You can definitely see how some of these fights, they don't just happen magically. They don't just snap their fingers and these fights get made. But the problem is what these fighters say. They contradict themselves. I have an O and I'm not afraid to let it go. So I just think that, when you say something, it's out there and people can go back and reference it any time. And then when you make a total 360 and say the total opposite of what you said prior, people are going to call you out on that. To sit there and say that, I have 2 belts, I'm the man. So basically, you can hold those belts hostage, you can rest on your laurels, and then saying, oh, well, I got mandatories. We know in the sport of boxing that there's ways to get around mandatories. You could file for an exception. You can get a voluntary defense. We've seen Anthony Joshua do that when they filed the correct paperwork, and he was able to fight Vladimir Klitschko, instead of having to make his mandatory right away, so he didn't have to vacate that IBF title because Eddie Hearn and Joshua's team filed the proper paperwork, and that's how that Vladimir Klitschko fight was able to take place. I don't think anyone or any sanctioning body would really get in the way of a Keith Thurman Errol Spence fight. So I think there's ways of getting around that mandatory. Now, if Keith Thurman thinks that maybe he needs 2 fights to be ready to fight Errol Spence, I don't know. I mean, we let's really think about it. He's only been off 9 months so far. Errol Spence was off 9 months, and he was ready, willing, and able to take on Kell Brook after a long layoff, and he's coming off another long layoff, and he's ready, willing, and able to take on Lamont Peterson. So I think by the time Keith Thurman gets back in the ring, he'll probably be off maybe 14 months, a year to 14 months. How many fights does he really need to get back into the swing of things? Deontay Wilder was coming off an injury. He had 1 fight, and then he was ready to jump right in there with Luis Ortiz. So these guys are on a certain level. So how much time do they really need to come back from an injury? I mean, not necessarily injury, but come back to be in fighting shape. Like, he's only 29 years old, Keith Thurman. Like, how bad is his muscle memory? How many tune-ups will he really need to be ready for Spence? It's not like, he's going to be off for like 3 years, 2 years, similar to the Andre Ward situation, similar to the Mikey Garcia situation. He's going to be off probably a year and a couple months. And obviously it's understandable to have a tune-up fight. But then talking about the mandatory and using that as an obstacle to not fight Errol Spence. I mean, you have 2 belts. You're a unified champion. The expectations for you are going to be high. And it's realistic for us to have those expectations of you. So I think the frustration lies in the contradiction in your statements, the dismissive attitude you have towards Errol Spence, and saying that there's absolutely no way that you would be able to avoid a mandatory when other fighters have done that. They've gotten exceptions. Deontay Wilder paid Stavern Stepaside money so he could fight Luis Ortiz, and obviously that didn't work out the way it was supposed to, but there is ways of avoiding mandatories. And you're affiliated with one of the most powerful men in the sport, and I'm sure he can help you avoid a mandatory if if you really want to fight Errol Spence in a unification fight. So like I said, I think the attitude of Keith Thurman, the contradiction, and him kind of downplaying Errol Spence, people are going to call him out on that. They're going to call him out on that. They're going to sit there and say, well, when you say you're not ready, is it basically you saying that Errol Spence is just too much for you? Is he just that type of fighter that you're going to try to push off as long as you can and fight all these other guys and make the most money you can before fighting Errol Spence? Because maybe in the back of your mind there is some apprehension that you could lose that fight. But again, going back to the original statement you made several times for at least 3-4 years now, I've got an O and I'm not afraid to let it go. So which one is it? You let that O go, or do you kind of hold those titles hostages? That's my opinion on the whole thing. The downplaying of Errol Spence and the hypocrisy. I don't want to sound redundant because I've repeated myself a couple times on that, but I want to just hammer those 2 points home before I end this video. But yeah, that's just my opinion on the whole thing. I thought that Keith Thurman had 2 razor close fights back to back. I thought that he narrowly beat Sean Porter. I had that fight 115, 113. I know a lot of people had Sean Porter winning that fight. I had him beating Danny Garcia 115, 113. And I am kind of seeing a pattern with Keith Thurman. I want you guys to keep this in mind, because I know there's a lot of Keith Thurman fans out there and a lot of people who believe that Keith Thurman would beat everybody, including Errol Spence in this division. But look at the pattern. He seems to be able to be worn down late in fights by guys who put the pressure on him and guys who go to the body on him and trap him in corners. When you take that space away from him and cut off those escape routes, like Sean Porter was able to do, and even Danny Garcia, who's not really fleet of foot, he was able to cut the ring off in the second half of that fight when Keith Thurman started slowing down. He was putting rounds in the bank. He made that fight competitive because of what he did in the second half. And then Sean Porter had a fast start, and then in the middle rounds, kind of Keith Thurman took over, but then he finished strong. And Errol Spence finished strong against Kell Brook. He trapped him in corners. He cut the distance down, and he made the fight the type of fight he wanted. He got inside Kell Brook's long jab, and he was ripping the hell out of Errol Spence's body, and then he was just going right back upstairs after he put in that damage to the body, and he was really mixing up the attack, really throwing some great combinations, really fluid combinations in there, and he systematically broke Errol Spence down late in that fight. And I'm sure Keith Thurman saw that fight, and that definitely, I would assume, which is my opinion, I definitely think that probably set some red flags in Keith Thurman's mind about Errol Spence. So those are some things to keep in mind. I think that Errol Spence definitely has a style that would be extremely problematic for Keith Thurman, who in recent fights has really moved a lot, was really fought defensively more so than ever, especially since he's fought the top level guys. And we've seen a difference in his style against these top level guys who have who can punch a little bit or who are physically strong and guys who can put pressure on him. He seems to be a little bit more defensive minded now as opposed to how he was earlier in his career. And I think that his approach to the sport maybe has changed too. He's gotten married. Seems to me maybe to have lost a little bit of that eye of the tiger. I mean, this is just my opinion. You guys can definitely comment on that if you disagree. But Errol Spence is a young kid, just won the title. He's hungry, and he's coming off 2 layoffs. He's not happy about that. This guy's chomping at the bit to get things done now. Okay, he feels ready now. He's confident in his ability now. He's going to collect those belts now and then make the money later. Which I'm just assuming that's just the vibe I'm getting from his attitude and what he's saying in interviews. And I think he's real about it. I think he's real about it. And whereas Keith Thurman, I think he's trying to follow that Floyd Mayweather blueprint, like, hey, all roads lead to Keith Thurman. I got the 2 belts. But you know what? You can't be acting like Floyd Mayweather or trying to act like Floyd Mayweather if you haven't done what Floyd Mayweather has done. Floyd Mayweather definitely has shown, even when throughout that whole Manny Pacquiao drama situation, when that fight took so long to get made, both of those guys were still pulling in, 1 million, 1.5 million pay-per-views for their events. And people still wanted to see them. With all due respect to Keith Thurman, you're not on that level. You're not on that level. So, you may think you're in that position where, you know what, I can fight who I want. I'm going to get paid regardless. But I'm not so sure that's going to be the case. I think people are going to start resenting the fact that maybe you didn't fight Errol Spence, or you're not fighting Errol Spence when they want you to. And I think you're not a Mayweather, you're not a Canelo, you're not an Anthony Joshua. You're not a household name in mainstream sports. So for you to kind of lay back and think that you have all this juice, I just don't see it. He name drops Floyd Mayweather a lot when he tries to justify things that he's doing right now. And you can't really do that because as I said, you are not Floyd Mayweather. You are no way near close to that position that he was in. And for him to be in that position, he already had a lot of years in the game before he was established in that type of situation where he could dictate how he dictated later in his career, and fought when he wanted to fight and commanded those huge paydays. And you're not in that same spot. So I don't think you should try to play that same card that Floyd Mayweather played, because I don't think it's going to work out for you. But that's all I got for now, guys. Once again, have a happy holidays. Christmas coming up, New Year's coming up. And don't forget to check us out on the Ringside Reporter podcast every Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Feel free to call in 323-870-3857. And hopefully 2018 will be that year where we get these fights we want. Hopefully we can get Joshua Wilder in 2018 as promised by Eddie Hearn. And hopefully we can get that Canelo-Golovkin rematch as well. Beaver's out. Till next time. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.